The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects trapped in plastic. Laura Bennett moved through Sacred Heart Hospital's ICU with the kind of invisibility that only comes from perfecting the art of being unremarkable for 15 years, soft-soled shoes silent on linoleum, her grey-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun, scrubs that matched everyone else's except for the way she moved inside them. Precise. Economical. A body that remembered things her mouth would never say. She checked the vitals on bed 3 without looking at the patient's face, her hand steady as surgical lasers as she adjusted the flow rate. The other nurses had stopped noticing her somewhere around year 7. They ate lunch together in the break room now without asking if she wanted to join. She preferred it that way. Less conversation meant fewer chances to slip, fewer moments where something old and dangerous might leak through the careful construction she'd spent a decade and a half assembling. The morning shift at Sacred Heart moved at its own rhythm. Beeping monitors. The wheeze of ventilators working in mechanical synchronization. The occasional call bell from patients who didn't understand that pressing the button 50 times didn't make it any less of a request. Laura had learned the language of the unit the way she'd learned Pashto once, with complete attention to detail and no wasted motion. She changed dressings. She documented observations. She asked no questions about the decisions made by the attending physicians because asking questions drew attention, and attention was the opposite of what she needed. At 7:15 a.m., during her 15-minute break, she opened her locker. The photo was still there, her husband in dress blues, his smile caught in time before the infection that took him 5 years ago. Beside it lay a letter on military stationery, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. The signature belonged to Captain Marjah Hale, written when he was still a lieutenant. When her son David was still alive. The letter said things about duty and sacrifice and brothers who never came home that made her press her hand against her chest, right where the scar tissue was thickest. She touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one that had been in her locker since the day a colonel in a gymnasium somewhere in Langley had told her that her service records were being classified, that her name was being removed from every database, that the men she'd saved in Marjah would stay alive only as long as she stayed erased. She touched it the way other people touched crosses or lucky coins, a prayer to a god she'd stopped believing in 14 years ago. The PA system crackled at 2:24 p.m. Incoming ICU transfer. Bed 7. Laura was already moving before the announcement finished. She prepared the room with muscle memory, checking the monitor leads, ensuring the crash cart was positioned within arm's reach, reviewing the chart before the patient arrived. Details. Everything was details. The stretcher wheeled in at 3:04 p.m., and Laura's breath caught once, hard, before her composure locked back into place like a safe door closing. The man on the stretcher had aged the way combat does to people, too fast and all in the wrong direction. His right leg ended at mid-thigh, a surgical amputation that was clean and professional. His left arm bore the pink and white patterns of deep burn scarring that ran from wrist to shoulder. But it was his face that made her hands move on their own, checking vitals, adjusting tubes, doing the 1,000 small things that kept her from having to make eye contact. Captain Marjah Hale. She was certain of it. The scar tissue along his right temple matched the description from David's final letter home. The way his eyes moved through the room, assessing every exit and every potential threat, that was pure special operations. That was the way men learned to look when they'd spent too long in places where the scenery wanted to kill them. Captain Hale is post-op day from his revision amputation, the transfer nurse said, handing her the chart. Laura's eyes moved across the clinical notes without registering the words. Waiting for a decision about his pain management protocol. Started seizing last night in post-op recovery, they're still working up the seizure disorder. Blood pressure's been unstable, and he's been asking for a higher pain regimen ever since he woke up. Laura nodded once, because speaking would be a mistake. She had the chart memorized before the transfer nurse left the unit. Captain Hale's eyes tracked her as she worked, watching, analyzing, but he didn't speak, and neither did she. The rule was silence. The rule had always been silence. Dr. Sterling arrived on the unit at 4:15 p.m. like a Cologne advertisement stepped off a billboard. His white coat was starched so aggressively it could probably draw blood. His shoes were Italian leather that cost more than Laura made in a week. The hospital board credential hanging from his neck had been updated to reflect his new position, Director of the Cardiovascular and Trauma Services, a title he'd apparently earned through the kind of excellence that existed entirely in the minds of board members who'd never seen him actually treat a patient. He moved through the ICU rounds with his attending trailing behind him like a satellite, already complaining about staffing deficiencies and nursing protocols that weren't aggressive enough, about the need for a new culture of accountability that Laura translated immediately as the need for people to stop questioning his decisions. The attending kept nodding like a bobblehead with dead batteries. Bed 7, Dr. Sterling said, reviewing the chart without looking at the patient. Captain Hale. Amputation revision, post-op day 4, seizure activity overnight. Laura continued her assessment at the bedside, checking the peripheral foresight, noting the swelling that suggested the fluid rate was slightly too aggressive. Small details. Details that might matter or might not. Details that were absolutely not her job to volunteer unless asked directly. Captain Hale's daughter was in the room. She'd arrived that morning, had spent the day moving between the waiting area and the bedside with the careful devastation of someone watching their parent be rebuilt from parts. She sat in the corner chair now, her phone dark in her lap, her attention completely on her father's face. "Your daughter," Dr. Sterling said to Captain Hale, not looking at the daughter. "She's concerned about something." Captain Hale's jaw tightened. "The pain protocol. It's insufficient. I'm experiencing significant discomfort in the surgical site, and the current regimen is not." "We don't want to be too aggressive this early post-op," Dr. Sterling interrupted, still not looking at the chart. "Pain is information. The pain tells us when we need to slow down, when we need to be cautious. We increase too quickly and we risk dependence, complications, secondary diagnoses that become harder to manage than the original injury." Laura's hands continued their work. Checking the dressing. Documenting the time. Saying nothing because speaking would be a mistake. "With respect, sir," the daughter said quietly. "His oxygen saturation drops every time his pain spikes. The nurse said that yesterday, didn't you?" She looked toward Laura. "You said his respiratory rate climbs and his oxygen drops when the pain peaks." Laura felt Dr. Sterling's attention turn toward her like a searchlight. "The nurse mentioned her concerns," Dr. Sterling said, his voice changing into something smoother and more dangerous. "But what the nurse mentioned was an observation from someone who hasn't studied medicine for the better part of a decade. Captain Hale is receiving appropriate pharmacological intervention for his condition. The protocol is sound, and I'm confident that if we stick with the evidence-based approach rather than reacting to every patient complaint, we'll see excellent results." Captain Hale's breathing quickened slightly. His heart rate climbed. Laura watched the monitor numbers tick upward, 102, now 108, moving toward tachycardia, and she kept her expression neutral as the very thing Dr. Sterling said wouldn't happen started happening in real time on the screen directly above the doctor's head. "We're going to continue the current regimen," Dr. Sterling said, already moving toward the door. "Check in with me if anything changes. But I anticipate we'll be able to discharge this patient to inpatient rehabilitation by end of week if we maintain this conservative approach." The daughter's face did something complicated, anger and resignation and the dawning understanding that she wasn't going to win this fight. "Not here. Not now." Laura finished her assessment. She charted her observations in the electronic record, documenting everything she'd seen, every vital sign change, every moment when conservative pain management had collided with physiological reality and lost. She documented in precise clinical language that meant nothing, that protected nothing, that changed nothing because Captain Hale's pain management protocol was not her decision to make. At 5:33 p.m., when the shift ended and the night nurse came on to take over Captain Hale's care, Laura removed her work badge and placed it in her locker next to her husband's photograph and that letter signed in Captain Hale's hand. She touched the unit patch sewn inside her jacket. Then she drove home through Houston traffic to an apartment where nobody knew her name, and she pressed her hand against the scars on her forearms, and she understood, the way she'd understood so many times before, that some mistakes never stop following you. What she didn't know was that Captain Hale had recognized her too. The morning rounds at Sacred Heart started like every other morning, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical drone, the ventilator in bed 7 wheeling its rhythm like a metronome counting down something neither of them could name. Dr. Sterling arrived at 7:02 a.m. with his tablet and his reputation and his golf plans for the weekend, moving through the ICU with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to look busy without actually listening. He stopped at the unit communication board near the nursing station, the one where discharge summaries and shift reports clustered like fallen leaves, and he read aloud from a fabricated performance write-up that made the fluorescent lights seem to buzz louder. Nurse Bennett continues to demonstrate difficulty accepting physician authority. Multiple instances of questioning medical decisions in front of patients and families. Recommendation: counseling for professional boundaries. His voice carried the tone of a man reading nutritional facts, casual and dismissive and utterly certain of his own righteousness. Laura stood 3 feet away, and clasped in front of her, taking one measured breath through her nose. The scars on her forearms, thin white lines that told stories her mouth would never tell, were hidden beneath her sleeve cuffs. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Around her, the other nurses suddenly discovered fascinating details in their patient charts, their shoes, the medication dispensary. Nobody looked at her. Nobody made eye contact. That was the calculation in every silent moment, the cost of loyalty versus the cost of association. They all knew which was more expensive. Captain Hale's daughter, Jennifer, was in the break room when Sterling moved his performance theater there, the space where nurses ate lunch and pretended they weren't drowning. Laura sat at the small table by the window, turkey sandwich and an apple, trying to be invisible the way she'd perfected invisibility over 15 years. The women who'd shared this table with her, who'd complained about their kids' soccer schedules and their husbands' indifference and the government's broken promises about healthcare pensions, they stood up one by one when she sat down. Rebecca found a phone call she suddenly needed to take. Marcy remembered a patient who probably needed checking. Sheila just carried her lunch tray to her car, claiming the weather was too nice to waste indoors. The chairs emptied like a tide going out, pulling everything with it except Laura, who sat alone with her sandwich and one tear that escaped without permission and was wiped away before anyone could witness it as weakness. She pressed her hand against her forearm, against the scar tissue beneath the sleeve, against the geography of everything she'd survived that the women at Sacred Heart would never know about. That evening, Dr. Sterling returned to Captain Hale's room while Jennifer sat vigil beside the bed. The machines around her father beat their steady rhythm, pulse oximeter at 94%, cardiac monitor showing a controlled sinus rhythm, the slow drip of his pain medication ticking through the 4-line at exactly the pace Dr. Sterling had prescribed. Sterling moved with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned successfully, who'd built his reputation on board connections rather than clinical excellence, who understood that institutions protected their own. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice carrying that tone that made every word sound like it was being read to a child, "I think you'd be much happier in a less demanding role. Perhaps medical records? Somewhere your particular skill set would be better utilized." His smile was practiced. His certainty was absolute. Laura took one measured breath. She looked directly at Jennifer first, then at Captain Hale, who was watching this unfold with eyes that had seen worse than this petty cruelty. Then she turned to Dr. Sterling, and when she spoke, her voice was steady as a surgical laser. "Captain Hale deserves better than a doctor more concerned with his next promotion than his patient's dignity." It wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was calm. It was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and understanding that everything else is just noise. Sterling's face went red, actually red, the color rising from his jawline like a thermometer climbing. "We'll discuss your future here very soon," he said, the threat hanging between them like humidity before a Houston storm. "I promise you that." But that wasn't the worst part. What neither of them knew was that Sterling had already made the calls. By the next morning, he was sitting in the hospital president's office, a room with mahogany furniture and a view of the medical complex and the kind of casual authority that only came from years of golf outings and charity board dinners. "I hate to bring this up, Richard, but we have a liability issue in ICU," Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern, the kind that gets taken seriously because it wears the mask of reluctance. Nurse with boundary problems. Questioning physician orders. Undermining care in front of patients and families. The president, whose last round of golf with Sterling had gone 18 holes and 3 drinks deep, frowned with the expression of a man already leaning toward a predetermined decision. 15 years, you said? No prior issues. That's what concerns me, Sterling continued, his voice dropping to the register of confidential business. I did some digging. Her employment file has irregularities. The VA references she listed? Generic phone numbers, no real connections. Her previous military service? Gaps in the timeline that don't add up. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, making it personal. I think we need HR to investigate properly. For liability. For the hospital's protection. By afternoon, an HR investigator named Carla Peterson was pulling Laura's file from records, making calls to numbers that either didn't answer or answered with questions instead of information. The VA couldn't find detailed records. The previous duty stations confirmed dates but provided nothing substantive, no contact information, no supervisor names, nothing that could be verified because everything connected to Operation Copper Dune had been erased with the kind of official finality that left no fingerprints. Red flags piled up in Carla's investigation like evidence of something criminal. Sterling also called his contact at the Texas Medical Board, a contact he'd cultivated during his last hospital politics fight, suggesting they might want to review whether a nurse was practicing outside her scope of authority. The suggestion was casual. The implication was thorough. The machinery of institutional suspicion had been triggered, and once triggered, it ran on momentum and fear and the simple human tendency to protect hierarchies that already existed. Meanwhile, Laura worked her shifts with the same quiet competence that had carried her through 15 years at Sacred Heart. She checked on Captain Hale in the morning, noting his pain score was down from 8 to 5, better, though not ideal, and definitely not the kind of improvement that should be happening if a doctor wasn't willing to listen to the people actually monitoring the patient at night. You remind me of the medics I served with, Captain Hale said to her, his voice rough from the endotracheal tube they'd removed 2 days prior. That same calm. That same way of moving like every action matters. Laura smiled, but said nothing. She adjusted his checked the catheter site for signs of infection, made sure the cardiac monitor leads were making good contact. There were things she could do in silence that would be misunderstood if she spoke them aloud. Jennifer noticed something too, watching Laura move through her father's care with the precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times in circumstances much worse than a hospital room in Houston. Dad, she said quietly during one of the nursing visits, she has the same look in her eyes you get sometimes. Like she's seen things. Captain Hale studied Laura's face as she adjusted his pain medication drip, noting the subtle scars on her hands, not accident scars, not the kind you got from civilian injuries, but the specific kind that came from working in austere environments where you improvised and survived and didn't have time to worry about sterile technique. I think you might be right, he said to his daughter, but before he could ask, before any questions could be spoken into the space between them, Sterling appeared in the doorway with an HR representative and a security guard, and his expression carried the satisfaction of a man who'd just crossed the final I in his carefully constructed narrative of doubt. Ms. Bennett, Sterling said, his voice carrying the false courtesy of someone about to deliver bad news with bureaucratic efficiency, we need to speak in the conference room immediately. Laura looked at Captain Hale. She looked at Jennifer. She stood up, set down the 4-pump, and walked toward the door without rushing, without any sign that her world was about to collapse, because Senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett had learned a long time ago that the kind of strength that mattered most was the kind you wore on the inside, the kind that no one could take from you even when they took everything else. Dr. Sterling's office smelled of mahogany and ambition, the kind of space built to remind you of your smallness the moment you stepped inside. The hospital president, Harold Chen, sat across from him with the satisfied expression of a man who'd already made his decision before the conversation began. Sterling didn't bother with pleasantries. He'd learned long ago that boardroom power operated on a different frequency than human courtesy. Harold, I need your support on something sensitive, Sterling said, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. One of my nurses has been creating problems. Nothing actionable individually, but the pattern is concerning. Chen leaned back in his leather chair, waiting. They'd played golf together for 7 years. They served on the same charity board for pediatric cancer research. These things created bonds that transcended the organizational chart. She questioned my clinical judgment in front of a patient's family, Sterling continued. Undermined my authority. Now she's spreading doubt among the other staff, suggesting I don't prioritize patient care. He paused, letting that settle. I'm worried about liability. Her background doesn't quite add up either. Employment gaps. References that seem thin. Chen's expression didn't shift, but Sterling knew the calculation was happening behind those eyes. The hospital had been sued 3 times in the past 5 years. Any hint of a credibility problem with staff could become a deposition's nightmare. What do you need? Chen asked. I've asked HR to do a full investigation into her employment verification, Sterling said. References, credentials, the whole file. But I wanted you to know it was coming. In case she tries to make this personal, plays the victim angle. He smiled slightly. People like her often do. Chen nodded slowly. Keep me updated. And Sterling? Make sure your documentation is solid. We can't afford another mess. By the next morning, Sterling had already contacted the VA hospital where Laura had listed her most recent prior employment. He didn't call the main line. Instead, he'd found the number for the Credential Verification Department, the kind of administrative office where nobody asked follow-up questions about why a reference check was being conducted. I'm calling on behalf of Sacred Heart Hospital in Houston, he told the woman who answered, his voice wrapped in the kind of official concern that made people assume you had authority. We're verifying employment history for a nurse named Laura Bennett. She worked with you, correct? There was a pause. Computer keys clicking. I'm not seeing anyone by that name in our system. That's interesting, Sterling said, letting his tone sharpen slightly. That's what she claimed on her application. She indicated she worked here for 2 years, 2009 to 2011. In what capacity did she serve? Sir, I'm telling you we don't have a record. Are you sure about those dates? Sterling hung up. He didn't need more. The seed was planted. A claim of employment that couldn't be verified. References that didn't exist or wouldn't cooperate. By this afternoon, HR would have enough ammunition to suspend her pending investigation. And once she was suspended, Sterling could move freely with Captain Hale's care without her presence complicating things. The HR investigator's name was Patricia Kimmons, and she had the demeanor of someone who'd spent 20 years learning how to make people feel guilty regardless of their actual culpability. She carried a file that was surprisingly thick for a 15-year employee, or perhaps not surprising at all, given that Sterling had been very specific about which documents to examine and which gaps to emphasize. The conference room at Sacred Heart smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Laura sat at the table with her hands folded, her badge clipped to her scrubs in the precise position it had occupied for 15 years. Across from her, Kimmons opened the file with the slowness of someone savoring the moment. Ms. Bennett, Kimmons began, not looking up, I've been reviewing your employment history as part of a routine verification process. I have some concerns I'd like to address. Laura waited. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound like electricity trying to escape confinement. Your resume indicates you worked at the VA facility in Houston from 2009 to 2011, correct? Yes, Laura said simply. I contacted that facility this morning. They have no record of employment under your name during those years. Kimmons looked up now, her eyes carrying the particular brightness of someone who'd just caught someone in a lie. Can you explain that? Those records were transferred, Laura said, keeping her voice level. The facility reorganized their credential system in 2012. Older files were archived. Did you contact them to inform them of your new employment? I provided references at the time of my hiring at Sacred Heart. They were contacted directly. Kimmons made a note. Those references were rather generic, according to our files. No direct supervisor contact information. No specific clinical details. She turned a page in the file. And there's a gap here. November 2001 to September 2004. Nearly 3 years with no employment listed. What were you doing during that period? The question hung in the air like smoke. Laura's hands remained still on the table, though something flickered across her face, not quite visible, but present, like a shadow of something vast moving beneath dark water. Personal reasons, Laura said. Personal reasons, Kimmons repeated, writing it down as if she'd just transcribed an admission of guilt. The hospital needs to verify all employment history for credential purposes. Those 3 years are a significant gap. And frankly, given the other documentation issues, I'm concerned about the accuracy of your background. The door opened. Dr. Sterling entered with a kind of timing that suggested he'd been waiting in the hall, which he had. He sat down beside Kimmons with an expression of professional concern. I asked Sterling to join us, Kimmons said, given that you report directly to him and he's been the one flagging concerns about your recent performance. Laura looked at Sterling. Something cold moved behind his eyes, the look of a man who'd successfully calculated an outcome and was now watching it unfold exactly as planned. The issue is larger than just documentation, Kimmons continued. There are gaps in your employment record that we can't verify, references that won't or can't be contacted, and a significant period of time where you appear to have been unemployed or engaged in undisclosed activities. For a nurse handling critical care patients, this creates a liability issue. My nursing license is current, Laura said, her voice dropping lower, taking on the quality of a command given in a voice that had once directed emergency procedures in a burning compound. You can verify it directly with the Texas Board of Nursing. Every hour I've worked here is documented. Sterling leaned forward slightly. But that's the problem, isn't it? The gaps before you came here. We have no way of verifying your background during those years. And frankly, the pattern suggests you may have been misrepresenting your qualifications. I have been transparent about my credentials since my hiring, Laura said. Your credentials are what we're questioning, Kimmons said crisply. She pulled out a final form, already signed by the hospital president. Given the documentation discrepancies and the employment verification issues, I'm recommending a suspension of your clinical privileges pending a complete background investigation. You'll remain on administrative leave until HR can conduct a thorough verification of your employment history and contact all references directly. Laura's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. But something shifted in the room, a pressure change, like the barometric drop before a storm. Effective immediately, Kimmons continued. Dr. Sterling has already approved your removal from the schedule pending clearance. Laura looked at Sterling. Captain Hale is in ICU bed 4. He's unstable. I'm aware of his status, Sterling said smoothly. I'll assume his care. His pericardial drain is showing signs of kinking. His heart sounds are muffled. His pulse pressure is narrowing. Sterling's jaw tightened. I've examined him. He's stable. Your catastrophizing is exactly the kind of behavior that prompted this investigation. Laura stood up slowly, deliberately, the kind of movement that had once involved putting on body armor and checking weapons. I need this in writing. The suspension. The charges. All of it. Kimmons pushed the paperwork across the table. Already documented. You can appeal within 30 days, but these terms are effective immediately. You're not to access patient records, prescriptions, or clinical systems. You're to vacate the hospital by end of shift. A security escort will ensure compliance. Laura picked up the papers. The ink was still wet on Sterling's signature. She could see the curve of his letters, the flourish of his ego made manifest in ballpoint pen. I'll need to transition Captain Hale to another nurse, she said, looking directly at Sterling. Jennifer, his daughter, will need to be informed of the change in care team. I'll handle that, Sterling said. I'm sure you have enough to worry about. Laura walked toward the door, the papers held at her side like a medical chart. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next, what was already happening on the other side of the hospital, Sterling had no idea was already in motion. Because even as Kimmons had been reading through her fabricated employment gaps, Laura's hands had made a choice that no amount of documentation could undo. She'd made her first move 3 hours earlier when she'd paged the resident about Captain Hale's declining vitals. She'd documented her concerns in the nursing notes with the precision of someone writing an official record. And she'd done something that only someone with years of field experience would even consider. She'd left her badge clipped to the medication cart in Captain Hale's room, positioned so it would show the time, 7:42 a.m. Timestamp on everything. Timeline documented. And her clinical assessment in the chart, crystal clear, from 7:45 a.m., patient developing signs of cardiac tamponade. Beck's triad positive. Drain kinked. Require immediate intervention. She'd done her job. What happened next wasn't her decision to make. But it was about to become impossible to ignore. The monitor's alarm cut through the ICU darkness at 3:22 a.m. One sharp beep. Then continuous. Blood pressure 68/40 and dropping. The pericardial drain had kinked. Laura was already moving before the resident opened his eyes. She didn't run. Runners panicked. She walked to Captain Hale's bedside with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The on-call resident, Dr. Patel, maybe 28, still wore the confusion of sleep on his face. He stared at the monitor like it might explain itself if he looked hard enough. His lips parted. No sound came out. O2 sat dropping, 88, 86, 84. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, fighting a losing battle. Captain Hale's eyes were open. Panicked. Drowning while lying flat. Call the cardiac surgeon. Now, Laura said. Not a request. It was the voice of someone who'd issued commands on battlefields where hesitation meant bodies. The resident flinched. His hand moved toward the phone, then stopped. Froze. Textbook knowledge without battlefield experience was like a parachute without a ripcord. Laura positioned the ultrasound probe against Captain Hale's subxiphoid area, scanning for fluid. There. A massive collection surrounding the heart. Pericardial tamponade. The heart drowning in its own fluid, compressed, unable to pump. 60 seconds and he'd code. What are you? The resident started. Get. The. Surgeon. Laura's voice didn't rise. It dropped. That was worse. She prepped the subxiphoid approach with 2% chlorhexidine, her hand steady as a surgical laser. 23 years since Marjah, but muscle memory doesn't expire. Her hands moved on their own. 18-gauge needle. A 45-degree angle toward the left shoulder. Advancement centimeter by centimeter. The resistance of tissue parting. The sudden give when the needle entered the pericardium. Dark blood filled the syringe. 200 cubic centimeters of it. Then 200 more. Captain Hale's blood pressure stabilized, 78/52. Then 82/58. O2 sat climbing, 86, 88, 92. His eyes cleared from panic to something like relief. You bought him 12 minutes, she told Dr. Patel, who was still holding the phone, face the color of institutional paste. The surgeon will finish it. The cardiac surgeon arrived 11 minutes later. She took one look at the setup, the clean needle placement, the measured extraction, the stabilized vital signs, and nodded with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. Clean procedure. You bought him the time he needed. She didn't ask who'd performed it. She didn't need to. The work spoke. Jennifer Hale was crying, gripping Laura's hand with both of hers. You saved my father's life. Not a question. A fact. A debt unpayable. Laura didn't answer. She was already thinking about what came next. She knew. Sterling had access to the hospital president's personal line. She'd heard him talking about it in the physician's lounge when he didn't know she could hear. One call, he'd said once. That's all it takes. One call and things happen. By morning shift, things had happened. Security was waiting at the time clock. Not aggressively. Politely. The kind of professional removal that felt worse than anger. Sterling stood near the unit secretary's desk with a termination letter, the paper printed on cream-colored hospital letterhead like it made this more official. More clean. More justified. Performing procedures outside your scope of practice, he said, reading aloud so the entire morning shift could hear. The nurses gathered for report went still. He read it like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Practicing medicine without a license. Patient safety liability. His voice didn't crack. He'd practiced this before. Effective immediately, you're terminated for cause. The security guard, older, probably a veteran himself, handed her the cardboard box. She'd seen this before. Combat deployments ending. People getting on planes, going home, never coming back. This was that feeling. That finality. Laura took the box. Her hands didn't shake when they carried it. They held perfectly steady as she walked to her locker and began pulling out the few things she kept there. A photo of David in his dress blues. A handwritten note from Captain Hale from 3 months ago, "The world needs more nurses like you." She was reaching for the faded unit patch, the one she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining for 15 years, the one that said who she was before she had to disappear when her hands betrayed her. They shook. Just slightly. Just enough that she had to grip the edge of the locker to hold steady. The patch came free. Stitches snapped. The fabric was grey now, faded to almost nothing, but the insignia was still visible. Special Forces. Home. "I'm sorry," Jennifer Hale said from somewhere behind her. Laura didn't turn around. She didn't have to. She already knew what she'd see. The apology in people's eyes. The guilt. The impossibility of changing what had been decided. She placed the patch in the cardboard box. The security guard walked her to the ER entrance. The same entrance where she'd carried stretchers, made life-or-death decisions, seen things that civilians never should. Now she was being escorted out like a liability. The rain started that evening. Cold. The kind of rain that felt personal, like it was specifically designed to soak through jackets and into bone. Laura stood in Memorial Gardens in southwest Houston, at the grave that held her husband's name and the date he'd died. She came here sometimes. Not often. The pain was less sharp now, but sharp enough. She pressed her palm against the wet stone. "I promised you I'd look after David's guys," she whispered. Her voice didn't crack. Training held it steady, even now. Especially now. "You said they'd need someone watching over them when they came home. Someone who understood. Someone with a medical background who could catch the problems the VA missed." The rain fell harder. She didn't move. "I couldn't even do that much." 72 hours. That's how long it took for everything to change again. Long enough for the rain to stop. Long enough for the sun to come back. Long enough for something else to arrive that would rewrite every assumption Sterling had made about the invisible woman he'd destroyed. 72 hours after security handed her that cardboard box, Laura stood in Sacred Heart's emergency department collecting her final paycheck, her hand steady as she filed the last signature. The fluorescent lights overhead cast that familiar gray pallor across the lobby, and she was almost to the exit when the paramedics wheeled in a trauma case, a man with aged features, shoulders hunched, one leg visibly swollen beneath the stretcher's blanket. His face was weathered beyond his years, marked by scars that spoke of violence survived, and as the paramedics rattled off vitals, something in Laura's chest compressed. The scar pattern. The distinctive colloid running from temple to jawline, crossed by a surgical scar from a shrapnel wound. She knew that scar. She'd watched it form in firelight 15 years ago in a compound in Marjah while negotiating with the man who wore it, a Taliban commander named Khalid Mansour who'd held her pinned in a crossfire until she'd talked him into releasing the wounded civilians trapped in that building. The man on the stretcher locked eyes with her as the paramedics rushed him toward intake, and his pupils dilated with recognition. He opened his mouth, then stopped himself, understanding the public space, the witnesses, the protocol. But his lips moved silently, forming two words in Pashto, Sanjin Haram. Chief. His voice, when he finally spoke, cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Assalamu alaikum, Chief Bennett. Laura's hands went still. Her heart did not race. Her breathing did not quicken. The training held. But everything else unraveled in those 4 words because no one in Sacred Heart had ever called her that, no one outside of classified operations archives had spoken her rank, and Captain Hale's daughter, who'd been walking past the intake desk with coffee for her father, stopped mid-stride, her eyes snapping from the patient to Laura to the badge clipped to Laura's scrubs that read only L. Bennett, RN. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then everything moved at the speed of military intelligence activation. Within an hour, the ICU filled with men who didn't belong on a standard hospital visit. They moved with purpose, with the fluid precision of operators, with the particular way that combat-trained personnel carry themselves through civilian spaces, shoulders back, scanning exits, assessing threats. Captain Hale's room became command central. Her son David stood in dress blues, his Marine uniform crisp as fresh surgical tape, and he was speaking to the charge nurse, to the hospital administrator who'd suddenly appeared, to anyone who would listen. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. She spent 12 years in SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. She's been sitting in your ICU anonymously for 15 years because of an operation so classified the Pentagon erased her service records. His voice didn't waver. It carried the same iron-core authority that had made him a squad leader, the same unwavering precision that said he'd had 15 years to rehearse this moment. She pulled my commanding officer out of a burning MRAP with her own hands. She saved his life in your hospital and you fired her for it. Captain Hale sat in his hospital bed, and the file in his trembling hands was stamped with headers that made every military person in the room straighten imperceptibly. Declassified BY authority of the Office of the Secretary of the Navy. His eyes moved across the pages, operation dates, mission objectives, personnel roster with Laura's name highlighted, the casualty reports that never happened because she'd negotiated them away. When he looked up at Laura, his eyes were wet. You negotiated the evacuation of 12 wounded civilians while pinned in a crossfire. You maintained radio contact with the quick reaction force through a dust storm that should have blinded their instruments. You kept them alive. His voice cracked on the last word. You never told anyone. SEAL Team Commander Price stood in dress whites, his chest a constellation of medals, and his voice carried the weight of institutional authority that made generals listen. He recited the decorations with the formal precision of a man who'd awarded them, Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire. The room absorbed that. Silver Star for Extraordinary Heroism. Breath held. Second Silver Star. Silence absolute. Navy Cross for actions above and beyond the call of duty, sustained courage in direct contact with enemy forces. Laura felt the room shift, felt the weight of recognition pressing down like a physical force. And 2 purple hearts. One from a shrapnel wound in the left shoulder. One from the operation in Marjah where she negotiated a surrender rather than risk civilian casualties. Commander Price's eyes met hers across the hospital room. Chief, we're bringing you home. The operation is declassified. You're recalled to advise on a federal task force. Not a request. It was a command, and Laura recognized the timbre of authority after 15 years of pretending not to hear it. The FBI liaison arrived with a tablet and a folder that made the hospital administrator pale. Federal investigation precedents. Operation Copper Dune declassified status. Recommendations for immediate reinstatement with back pay and compensatory damages. Dr. Sterling's name appeared on the page multiple times, specifically in relation to retaliation patterns, delayed care decisions, and personnel actions taken against a decorated service member in violation of federal protection statutes. When Dr. Sterling himself appeared in Captain Hale's doorway, still wearing his white coat like armor, his mouth opened and closed 3 times before any words emerged. This is highly irregular. The protocols require. The FBI liaison didn't look up from the tablet. Dr. Sterling, we need you to clarify your phone calls to the hospital president regarding Chief Bennett's employment termination within 2 hours of her emergency procedures on Captain Hale. Sterling's face drained of color. I acted within the scope of hospital policy regarding, you delayed pain management for a patient in your care. You then fired the nurse who corrected that decision. You did this immediately after she performed a life-saving procedure using skills you should have recognized as military-trained expertise. That's not policy. That's retaliation against a federal service member. Sterling backed out of the room like a man walking into fog. By evening, the hospital president called an emergency meeting. By the next morning, the Texas Medical Board opened a formal investigation. By that afternoon, Sterling returned to his office to find the security guard standing in the doorway, the same veteran with the combat infantry badge who'd walked Laura out 72 hours earlier, holding an identical cardboard box. Your severance, sir, the guard said, his face a neutral military mask that barely contained satisfaction. I believe you know the way out. Sterling was escorted past the ICU where he'd humiliated Laura, past the nurses who didn't look away this time but stared openly, past the unit board where his name was already being removed from the physician roster. The security guard didn't speak during the walk. He didn't need to. The symbolism carried the weight of a pronouncement. 6 months later, Laura walked through Sacred Heart's main lobby wearing credentials that made her official Director of Emergency Medicine. The hospital had recruited her specifically, her military background and crisis management expertise exactly what the department needed to rebuild its reputation in the aftermath of Sterling's termination. She moved through the lobby with the ease of someone who no longer had to make herself invisible, her bearing upright, her stride purposeful, her presence commanding the kind of attention that comes from hard-earned authority rather than title. Near the coffee kiosk, at a folding table wedged between the gift shop and a water fountain, Dr. Sterling sat in a suit that didn't quite fit, selling supplemental insurance policies to anyone who'd make eye contact. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. His reputation had dissolved into the kind of institutional memory that people speak about in cautionary whispers. He looked up as Laura passed, and recognition crossed his face, followed immediately by humiliation. Laura paused only long enough to adjust her credentials so the title was visible, Director. The faded unit patch framed on her office wall was waiting, no longer hidden in jacket lining but mounted beside her degrees, beside the decorations that could finally be displayed without violating the silence protocols that had controlled her existence. Captain Hale wheeled in for his weekly check-in, his condition stabilizing month after month, his daughter helping him navigate a rehabilitation program that would give him years back. Jennifer had enrolled in nursing school, inspired by the woman she'd seen operate under impossible pressure. David visited in his Marine uniform, proud of the mother who could finally be proud publicly, whose service could finally be acknowledged without threat to operational security. Commander Price had sent a bottle of good whiskey with a note, for the chief who taught us all that there's no rank in heroism. Laura stood at her office window overlooking Houston, watching Sterling pack up his folding table after another day of rejection, after another day of people recognizing him as the man who'd tried to destroy a decorated veteran and lost everything in the attempt. The city lights reflected in the window glass, and for the first time in 15 years, Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett didn't have to hide. She'd given everything to her country, then given 15 more years of silence in service of the men she'd saved, and the cost had nearly destroyed her. But she'd held the line. She'd maintained her composure. She'd waited. And when the truth finally emerged, it didn't just acknowledge her service, it vindicated every invisible moment, every humiliation endured, every promise kept. That's the story nobody tells about the quietest warriors, not just that they exist, but that they wait with the patience of people who understand that some victories take decades to claim. If you've ever had someone underestimate you because of who they thought you were, subscribe and let me know in the comments. And if you've ever suspected that the person standing next to you had a story bigger than they were allowed to tell, hit that like button.